the shame, a place of misery.
But when that cross held Jesus, as he took his final breath, it became an emblem of my liberty. I love the cross. I love the cross. For it was there I found life when I was lost. I don't know where I would be had there been no Calvary. I thank God for that old tree. I love the cross.
At the foot of Golgotha, where crimson mercy flows, there my every sin was washed away.
And though the cross no longer holds the Lord of life,
I live beneath its shadow still today.
I love the cross. I love the cross. For it was there I found life when I was lost. I don't know where I would be had there been no Calvary. I thank God for that old tree. I love the cross. Wherever he leads, whatever the cost, I would cling to that old rugged cross. I love the cross. I love the cross. For it was there I found life when I was lost. I don't know where I would be had there been no Calvary. I thank God for that old tree. I love the cross. I don't know where I would be had there been no Calvary. I thank God for that old tree. I love the cross. I love the cross. I love the cross. Born in slavery to sin, content to live apart from God, unaware of grace and unaware of truth, confined to labor on this earth. But a miracle occurred. The sun
has been crushed, and we've been rescued from its chains. Holy to the Lord, we're blameless in His sight, standing in His presence without stain.
Test, test. All right. Yeah. Well, Bruce probably said this one is for Harold. I don't know, but he's not officially an usher, but this is an usher, but he's the greeter. But the usher met the old lady at the door and just kind of asked her somewhat what area she wanted to be in, and she said, "I want to be on the front row." And he said, "Ma'am, you don't want that. Our preacher's just boring as he can be." And she says, kind of aggravated, she says, "Don't you know who I am?" And he said, "No." And she said, "I'm the pastor's mom." And he said, "Well, don't you know who I am?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Good," and walked off. But thanks for that, Bruce. We're going to take just another parenthesis. We'll be taking a few of these through the lesson, but this is an answer to a major question, and I do it timely now rather than 2 or 3 weeks down the road when it's not as fresh in mind. But we're dealing with the group that I think are the witnesses in the tribulation period, through the book of the tribulation period, the Stewards. And we're going to talk about them not in as big a detail as this was in the first book, and a lot of other stuff surrounding it, so we won't cover anything near that. And there's 6 pages here, which is 2 lessons. We'll try and get through it definitely today in 1 lesson, so we won't cover near everything even in that chapter, but hopefully it'll give you some understanding of what I'm talking about when I say the Stewards. And that name came about in the beginning. As I first thought about this group, I was tempted to call them the priests, prophets, and pastors. And that name was too long, so I was going to shorten it to the PP and P. But really, even those names, the prophets, the priests, and the pastors, are not a good name necessarily for this group, because it's not all-encompassing. There are a lot of other folks in this group than those 3. I thought about shepherds, which would be along these same lines. I thought about leaders, which would be along these same lines, and both of those, descriptive of some of the people in this, or the more prominent people in this group. But not all inclusive. I thought about workers, which was a very good name. and certainly could be used, I think. Laborers, ministers, I think, was a reasonably good, but we normally think of the word ministers in connection with pastors. So even though it means a lot more than that, we would think of it in terms of pastors. But I finally settled on the word steward, and I think that's an excellent name for this group. And we want to look at them, some things about them, several C's here about them, to kind of define who they are and understand more about them. First of all, they are chosen. God chooses this distinguished group from a godly cache of people already on their way to heaven. In the church age, from the time of Jesus' resurrection, everybody that trusted Christ has become a member of the church, the church of God, the overall church. Now, sometimes we join local assemblies, and that's a good thing, but that's not joining the church of God. The church of God is the overall church. Anybody that gets saved from the time of Christ's resurrection to, actually 50 days, the Pentecost feast after Christ's resurrection, I think, is when most people would think the official beginning of the church was, and that may be the case. From there till the church's rapture, everybody that gets saved through there is a member of this church and on their way to heaven. And out of that group, that's one of the groups that God uses to choose His stewards. They're chosen by God. In Israel's time, God chose from the nation Israel. And before Israel, it would have been the group before Israel. But from those three pools of godly people, God chose stewards and is still choosing stewards and will choose stewards clear through the tribulation period. Well, the bulk of the tribulation period. God may not always select as we would. At times, He chooses who we would choose. When He chose Saul as king, Saul was taller than all the other, a head taller, a foot taller than the other men, and we would naturally choose or tend to choose in that direction. And a lot of times God chooses that way too, but He doesn't always choose that way. Sometimes He chooses the least expected. I was always a competitor in sports, and I hated to lose. I just happened to think of that tennis match that me and Marty had one time in 105-degree heat, and oh my, neither one of us wanted to lose, and we were about even, and it was just back and forth. But anyway, I just happened to think of that right that moment. But many years ago, when we lived in the east end of the county, one of our neighbors organized a volleyball gathering on Saturday night and invited in all the neighbors. And of course, some of them had never played volleyball before. There was all manner of different qualities of volleyball players, men and women, and we were all fairly young, I think, at the time. But anyway, he'd select a couple of captains, and of course, when we would choose, the captains, whoever the captains were, would choose the best player, and the second best player, and the third best, and the fourth best, clear down until you got everybody chosen, everybody on a team. After 4 or 5 weeks, the host made himself a captain this particular time, and he chose one of the lesser players first. And I was watching. I wasn't one of the captains, so I wasn't choosing. But I thought, what in the world is he doing? He want to win? Or whatever? And finally, I realized, he was just. It was maybe becoming embarrassing to be the last one chosen, or toward the last, and it just showed how he valued everybody that was coming to the gathering, and And yeah, we played competitive, but that wasn't the whole deal. And and that's a lot of God sometimes chooses. And I think about Robert Pruitt, one of our first pastors. He said when he was in high school he was just timid as he could be, and didn't even want to take speech class because he'd have to get up in front of the class and give a speech, and could not dream that he would ever be a pastor. But God chooses who He chooses. Now this choosing is similar to the calling. We all understand the calling of a pastor and a minister, and we all understand that. That word is kletos. Actually, it's chosen, but it can mean called, invited, or summoned. And there's several Greek words that all mean similar things that are translated chosen, are translated called, even elect. But in each one of these, whether it be kletos, kaleo, or klesis, and there's several others, there's many others, there's a word in each one of these from Strong's Concordance that gives the meaning of these words. And in each one of them, there's a meaning called invited. Invited. And sometimes we get confused whenever the word chosen is used or called is used, and we think of, a couple of the more prominent ones are from parables, where Jesus ends the parable by saying, "Many are called, but few chosen." And not a lot of detail in that. It's a captivating statement, and easily misunderstood, as most of the parables and most of a lot of the sayings are, unless you know other scripture and you know other things. And the tendency over time has been for folks to misconstrue that, to say that many are called to salvation, but few are chosen to salvation. And that's not what that's saying. If I could say some more with it, let me just say that all people of all time that were ever born on this earth, from the beginning of time to the end, are and will be called to salvation. They'll be invited to salvation. Some will accept that invitation and many won't. But of those that accept the invitation, a few out of that group are chosen for special ministry. Now, I think that's what that verse is saying, and it's used 2 or 3 different times. It's used in the parable of the king whose invites to his son's wedding, he's not getting any responses, so he tells him to go out and invite everybody, invite all. And that's basically saying that God is inviting everybody to salvation. Same thing with the parable of the householder who hires day workers in his vineyard, and he hires one in the morning and one at noon and one in the afternoon and one just before they get on. He pays them all the same thing. Now that's the principle of the master of the ministers. He can do things however he wants to do. He paid them all the same. The ones that had worked all day complained about that, but that's his right to do that. He can choose who he pleases. Now, there's more to it than God's choosing. Conviction is the second part of that, and these folks that are chosen, we would ask the question, just like we did with the martyrs: can this choosing be denied? Can somebody be chosen for the ministry and them refuse that choosing? And the answer is yes, they can. They're still a Christian. They're still going to heaven. They're just not going to move into the steward group. And not very many do. I don't think there's a whole lot that do, but there are some that do. And but it's you have to accept the call. It's the call and the acceptance. Now, is the call to ministry or being chosen less mystical and happen more often by dedicated concern, faithfulness, loyalty, and availability than the audible voice of God or indisputable signs and circumstances? And if we think about that, how many times over the years have some folks missed the call to stewardship, waiting for a loud, clear voice, for the so-called call, as we call it. Much like the fellow who was stranded in the ocean when his boat sank, and he prayed to the Lord that he would deliver him. Soon a raft came up, and he said, "Oh, I see you got trouble there. Climb on in." And the fellow says, "No, I've prayed to God for Him to save me, so I'm gonna wait for that." And so the fellow goes on, and a small boat comes up, and he says, "Oh, you've got trouble there. Climb on in the boat." And no, I prayed to the Lord, and He's going to save me. And so the boat went on, and then the Coast Guard came up, and they said, "Now get in the boat here, and we'll take care of you." And no, I prayed to the Lord, and He's going to save me. And so they went on, and then the fellow soon after that drowns and goes to heaven. He was disgusted with the Lord, and he said, "Why didn't you save me?" And the Lord said, "Well, 3 times I provided, and 3 times you denied." And that's the case sometimes with the call to ministry. There, folks either outright say no, or, they call to deepest, darkest Africa, and they say, "No, I don't want to go." Sometimes they just don't understand the call, like this fellow in the ocean. They're being called, but they want just a little. They want more and more direction. And along those lines, the existence of a strong desire may be an indicator also of the calling. Paul certainly does not condemn one's desire for the office of a bishop in 1 Timothy 3:1. So the desire for that doesn't guarantee the call or the choosing of God, but that's definitely a good sign, and that's not discouraged. Now, who are the ministers? Who are these stewards, these folks we're talking about? And they are godly people over the ages who have been chosen by God to special work for Him and who have accepted His call. In the time of from Adam to Abraham, these folks would have been the family leader priests. Like Noah. Noah was one of the latter ones of those. And after the flood, when he got off of the flood, what was the first thing he did? He sacrificed some of his very rare seed stock. He built an altar right out of the ark. He built an altar and sacrificed to the Lord. And his family worshiped God right there. Now that wasn't the first time. That we don't see a lot of indication of that before. We've seen later on we see Abraham sacrificing several times, and we see the picture that is given that they have learned from somebody else, and Noah undoubtedly learned that from Methuselah. Methuselah learned it from probably all the way back to Adam. I'm sure that all of those family leaders were they were the family priest, basically. So that's where the priests come in. The first group, there were priests. Now, there were other people that were called to stewardship in that group, teachers, and there were folks that were called in that. When we move on to Israel, we know a little bit more about that group. So we see the godly prophets that were called of God, especially called by Him, kings, priests, scribes, rabbis, teachers, and so on. Many folks and their wives. I think anytime one is called to a special service, the other, unless they fight, unless they deny their role in some way, but generally speaking, I think the spouse is a part of that as well. They would be a steward. And then, of course, in the church today, and which we would understand the most for sure, pastors would be the first ones we'd think of, deacons, evangelists, missionaries. Now, I might say presidents and governors, mayors that are Christians, that are godly people, that are called to be a president. Jimmy Carter, I'd say, is a steward. He is a member of the Stewards. President Trump, I don't know. There was some testimony that he had accepted the Lord in recent years, and I hope that's the case. I wouldn't say that it was or that it wasn't. But if he is a Christian, he has been chosen to be president by the Lord, and he would be in this steward group. Now, anybody that's lost and a president, somebody that doesn't know the Lord, they're not in this group. Anybody that's a pastor that wasn't saved and never has been saved, and that occurs occasionally. It's somebody that's a leader in the church that hasn't truly been saved. They're not a steward. They're not truly chosen of God because they are only chosen from the group of godly people. Teachers, song leaders, Bible school directors, secretaries, groundskeepers, workers of all kinds, I think are in the steward group. Now, I would say this. I think that the steward group, and this is just me talking, so take it for what it's worth, but I believe the stewards are those of which it is said that 95% of the work in the church is done by 5% of the people. And I believe that 5% are the stewards, whatever their role is. Now, in smaller churches, I think that percentage is probably a lot larger. In a smaller church, it may be as high as 40% that are doing the work. But in larger churches, that 5% might be pretty close to right, and that's somebody just thrown that figure out. So certainly not going to be exactly correct, but that group is who I think the faithful doorman, the janitor, the groundskeeper, and workers of all sorts may be included in this elite brotherhood, the stewards. And you might ask, where would the line be drawn? Is someone that works in the nursery once a month and brings a casserole occasionally to church functions, are they a steward or are they the church? And I would just have to say that God knows. There are certain bounds, just like if somebody makes a profession of faith and they start coming to church and then they drop out and they come maybe once on Easter for 10 years, is that person truly saved? Well, pretty good sign they're not, but some of those folks are saved, and we don't know. We don't know about it. And same thing here. There are cases whereby only God would know who those folks are. Now, the next C that we look at is the caveat, the qualifications. We see that in stewards by the lists of character qualities and qualifications that are expected of them. More is reckoned of them than the church. We see that in Titus chapter 1, Titus chapter 2, 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4, 1 Timothy chapter 3, to mention some of those. And there are particular qualifications and character qualities that stewards are to have. To get into West Point, there are certain requirements. Not just anybody can go to West Point. It says that you will be evaluated in 3 areas: academic performance, demonstrated leadership potential, and physical aptitude. You must also meet strict medical qualifications and requirements. You must be a United States citizen at least 17 and not yet 23 years of age on July 1st of your year of admission. You must not be married, pregnant, or have a legal obligation to support a child or children. If you are a naturalized citizen, you must provide documentation. So there's qualifications to get into West Point. There's qualifications for stewards. There are things that stewards are supposed to achieve toward or attain toward. Stewards don't always measure up to these qualifications, but it is important to think about the idea that they are given in the Scripture. Doesn't that set these stewards apart? I mean, that makes them different from the rest of the church. Now, characteristics that they're to have, and I've just listed a bunch of these, I'm sorry, but try to listen to these. Working, feeding, ministering, teaching, calling, training, serving, comforting, helping, shepherding, being sober, being faithful, being serious, leading, preaching, baptizing, being circumspect, being vigilant, following Jesus, seeking unity, not greedy, being an example of sound doctrine, not violent, forth-telling, not given to wine, being blameless, hospitable, unselfish, being wise, being patient, being like Jesus, not covetous, overseeing, being sincere, crown of glory, being humble, winning souls, planning. And again, working is what this bunch is all about. And not everybody meets all of those qualifications, of course, but it's interesting to know that they are given. Estimates of the number of this group, I think, would place them one of the smaller groups that there would be. I think they'd be much, much smaller than the church itself. I think they'd be much, much smaller than the unaccountable, or those that die before the age of accountability. I think they'd even be smaller than the group of Israel. But I think they are a separate and distinct group, the stewards. Now let's look at examples from Scripture. And we see those people who are being chosen by God. They are godly people. They're on their way to heaven, but they're chosen by God. And Joshua is the first one of those. And we're going to go through these real quick because we got 15 minutes left. So I mean, we could spend probably another hour and a half on going into detail on these. But Joshua was not only a great leader chosen by God, a military leader, but a great preacher. He was always trying to get the children of Israel to choose God and live a dedicated, godly life. Of course, everybody knows the phrase that he gave, choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The choices that Israel made affected not only themselves, but their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, for good and for bad. There were very few in Bible accounts who made better choices or who were better stewards than Joshua was, and he was chosen of God. Proverbs 1:29 says, and Deuteronomy 30:19 says. Eli is the next one from 1 Samuel chapter 2. Eli's bloodline went all the way back to Aaron. Aaron was chosen by God out of the Levite family. And, of course, the Levites were chosen of God to serve the other 11 tribes. They were godly. They were on their way to heaven. God chose the tribe of Levi to be the priests, and he chose Aaron out of the Levites to be the head priest. Eli was a descendant of Aaron, and he was the last descendant of Aaron. His two sons were wicked fellows. They were not saved, so they were not a choice for God to be a steward, to follow on. So that line was going to die and did die with Eli's sons. And then God chose Samuel. Still of the tribe of Levi, but he was a Levite, but he was not a descendant of Aaron. Solomon was chosen in 1 Chronicles 28:5. We see by God. Israel is spoken of as being chosen by God. Deuteronomy 14:2. They were chosen as the people that Jesus, the bloodline in which Jesus would come out of. We also see the chosen from the fellows who said, "Here am I." Whenever God made a request or a choosing, these people were prominent right out front, saying, "Here am I. Use me, Lord." They were already on their way to heaven. Abraham was one of those in Genesis 22:11. Jacob in Genesis 31:11. Moses in Exodus 3:4. Isaiah in Isaiah 6:8. Samuel, of course, in 1 Samuel. We see it specifically in chapter 3, verse 4. Ananias in Acts 9:10 was one of these. And we also see it in the 12 apostles. Now, it's interesting on these 12 the 12 apostles are different from the 12 disciples. The 12 apostles, I believe the 12th apostle was Paul. I don't believe the drawing of the straws for Matthias. I don't think he was the 12th apostle. I think he was going to heaven. I don't think he was one of the 12 apostles. I think Paul was that 12th apostle. But interesting on the 12 disciples that... And here's another place where we can see that the choosing is not talking about salvation, because if we take it to its farthest extent, we would say that if God chose somebody, then they had to get saved. If it's choosing for salvation, and God chose them for salvation before the foundation of the world, we can take it the whole way there, but... then they had to be saved. But we see that isn't the case here in John 6:70, where Jesus said, "Did I not choose 12 of you, but one of you is a devil?" So now, hold on. If choosing is for salvation, then choosing everybody that God chooses is going to be saved. That proves right there that that's not the case. But the choosing is for service, and occasionally there will be somebody like Judas, Biden moment there. Judas Iscariot, yeah. Occasionally there will be a Judas Iscariot that is in the position, but shouldn't be there, should not be there. So even the chosen for service is has some broad aspects to it. And there are a lot of words. There are a terrible lot of words. It's a deep hole that you go in when you start studying chosen, called, and elect. There are a lot of Greek and Hebrew words, and we definitely do not have time to get into that. But I think just to say that in general, almost every one of those words has the word invited in the group. Now, sometimes it might have summoned in there too, which is a little more powerful invitation. Still doesn't determine that that's going to happen. But obviously there are some things that were predetermined. There were some things that were going to happen no matter what. But we don't know for sure what those were and what they weren't. But moving on here, the next one was Stephen in Acts chapter 2. Well, I've just got Acts 2. It's maybe Acts something else, and then verse 2. I apologize for that, but. And Paul and Barnabas are two that were chosen by God, Acts 13:2, Acts 16:9 and 10, Romans 1:1. Barnabas and Silas are chosen of God, Acts 15:22. Now this is for service. They're already saved. They're already going to heaven. They're chosen to be stewards. Mary was one of those who had a desire. And the Lord he basically chose her to be the one that anointed him before the crucifixion. She breaks the bottle of anointment over his head, and just before he's taken to be for the trial and to be crucified and the like. But she was chosen for that position, for that spot. She was a steward. And we dealt with the idea that it's possible to refuse that choosing, that calling, and I think we definitely see that. There's folks that we think probably were called to something and then just didn't accept the call. And there are those situations where somebody is mistakenly thinking they are chosen by God for a special service. Folks that are truly saved but think they're in a situation, and we see normally what happens in that situation is that these folks, like if it was a missionary or something, they would go to the field and then very quickly they would say, "Oh my, this isn't for me," and then they'd come back home and there'd be no more talk of missionary work again. Now, those are the folks that mistakenly, and I've read accounts of missionaries that I thought might have been in that situation, but there again, we don't know for sure. And that third group is that group that are not saved, and I think those are the ones that are spoken of in Matthew 22:14. Now, this can be false religion as well, but it's false Christian religion, because he says, "Depart from me, ye that work iniquity, into everlasting darkness. I never knew you." And I always try to emphasize when I quote that, I gave that verse in paraphrase there, but I usually try to say that he says, "I never knew you." These folks weren't Christians. They weren't saved. They may have been in a Christian type religion where Christ is talked about some, but never truly accepted him as their Savior. And they say, "Didn't we do great works in your name?" Now, this is not talking about Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus. It's talking about the Christian religion, false religions of Christianity. And he says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Now, I tell you what, I think we'll skip that whole section there. We've got about 3 minutes left. And let me just go to the last part, because I sure want, it's not long at all, but I definitely want to get it covered. A sobering thought. In my study on this, and this deals directly with Harold's question, and that's basically the reason for this lesson this morning, because he asked the prime question, the great question: who are the witnesses in the first part of the tribulation? If the church is taken out, which I believe it will be, I think it'll be raptured out the moment the tribulation begins. If the 144,000, which we looked at last week, and we'll finish up on them here in a couple of weeks. I think we'll probably just wait till it comes their time to finish up now. But the 144,000 aren't even introduced until about 3.5 years, almost over 3 years into the tribulation. They don't even start forming. And we dealt with that last week, that they are probably chosen of God. They are probably saved fellows who are chosen for another special purpose. And I don't nowhere that I can find says that they are witnesses. That's come from Bible scholars who have no idea who the 144,000 are, studied them, think, well, they have to be the witnesses, because there are no well, the Bible doesn't call them witnesses that I can see anywhere. They're talked about in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14. It says a lot of stuff about them, a lot of things. The two witnesses, now it does call them witnesses, the two witnesses, they aren't introduced until almost the end of the 7 years. I mean, we're well up in, we're over 6 years into the tribulation when the two witnesses are introduced. They're going to witness, but it's going to be in the last part of the 7 years and then the bulk of the remainder of the tribulation period. Who are the witnesses in the first part of the tribulation? And I think it's the stewards. I think the stewards are separate from the church. We work together. The stewards and the church work together, just like the stewards in Israel worked together 2,000 years ago. They work together. They're separate and distinct. The prophets, the scribes, the rabbis, and some of them might not have been truly saved either. But the ones that were truly saved, that were rabbis, were scribes and the like, they are members of the stewards, just like the stewards of today. But the stewards of today will not be raptured. Sorry, Shirley. So, sorry, Sandy. But the stewards will not be raptured with the church, and we'll go through a good part of the tribulation period. Is Sandy out there? Somebody's honking. But it's a terrible time, and we don't want to go through it. I hope I'm wrong. And I could be wrong. I could be wrong on that. But if it's not this way, who are the witnesses? It's the stewards. The pastors are still here. That's going to be another smoke screen going into the tribulation period. Lost people who have heard about the rapture and know that there's a possibility that church people may be taken out. They see Pastor Brian Allison here. Well, if he's still here, there hadn't been no rapture. No, Now, some so-and-so's missing. We don't know what happened to him, but Harold White, he's still here. He's the doorman. He'd have been taken out if there was a rapture. It'll be a smoke screen, but we'll be working and we'll be winning people to the Lord, just like we are now. But it'll be to the branch of Israel at that point, not to the church, for 7 years. Although we're going to see our rapture will be coming, and we'll see it in a couple of weeks. But so next week I'll do what I kind of was thinking about doing, was trying to finish up the 3.5 years, which would just take a few minutes, and then we'll deal with the moment that the second 3.5 years begin. And then we'll start into that second 3.5 year period, the 7 trumpets. Anybody got any questions or comments? Okay, we're past time, so we will close with that.